This year we've seen two of the biggest musical acts in popular music put out songs that are longer than 10 minutes. We had Coldplay with Coloracha and Taylor Swift's with All Too Well, Taylor's version, the 10-minute version. And this past weekend, Adele actually teased us that I Drink Wine was originally supposed to be for 15 minutes until the producer shied her away from that, basically saying audiences don't want that, they don't have the attention span, it won't sell. The backlash of her fans saying, no, we definitely want that, put out that kind of length of music, is starting to show that there's been a little bit of a shift in our cultural zeitgeist of allowing and welcoming longer songs. And this shift has kind of been going on for a little bit of time now. Venice Bitch from Lana Del Rey's NFR was around 9 minutes, and Kanye, Kendrick Lamar, and Frank Ocean all put out songs that were stretching the conventional track lengths within the past decade. So it might seem that these longer songs are a new phenomenon, but as any prog fan will tell you, it has been something that's been going on for quite a while. And that's part of the reason why I love prog. The 10 to 20 minute length track is expected rather than being the exception. I will also be the first to admit that progressive rock or prog is not really in the public's eye. Like, it's more of a niche genre of rock than it is a standard genre of rock. It is getting better, I will admit. Prog acts are selling bigger and bigger venues and getting more and more attentions. I mean, just from an anecdotal personal experience, the first time Haken came to Toronto, one of the bigger progressive metal bands out there currently, I saw them at the Hard Luck. It's a dingy bar that maybe holds 50 people. Same with Leprous. But the second time that I saw both of those individuals come to Toronto with a double headlining venue was at the Opera House on Queen Street, and that holds almost 1,000 patrons. The first time I saw Porcupine Tree was at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre in Toronto, which holds about 1,200 people. And the last time I saw Stephen Wilson was at Massey Hall, which holds about 2,700 people. So it is getting better, but I mean, in contrast, when I saw Taylor Swift and Coldplay, separately obviously, it was at Toronto Sky Dome. I won't call it the Rogers Centre, no matter who's holding the name on the building. But, the Sky Dome has a seating capacity of 53,000, and both Taylor Swift and Coldplay were playing across 2 nights. So there's a little bit of a difference between the amount of audience that both of these bands see. So seeing these two super acts put out songs that are well over the 10-minute mark, and doing so successfully, they could have just put it out and not really taking any traction, is showing the record studios and the record companies that long songs can in fact work in a popular setting. It did get me thinking about the history of long songs and why some people are thinking that only Taylor Swift or only Coldplay could do these things, when really there is a long history, pardon the pun, of long tracks. And in fact, this is actually a time period where long tracks are actually the exception rather than the rule. Because way back in the day, they were expected. They were the standout points. So let's talk about the history of long songs, why they were popular, what made them fall out of grace, and also show that we're living in a period when long songs are the exception before they were the rule. So as I mentioned before, it might seem that longer songs are a new phenomenon, especially within the, public cultural eye. But as I already had alluded to, prog fans will tell you that it's been a thing for a long time, especially in popular music. In fact, we don't need to look too far to see examples of popular acts putting out longer songs. I mean, for example, but I think we can actually look much further than that. If we go back a few more decades, even further than that. Purple rain, purple rain. Okay, I know I'm kind of beating around the bush. We're looking at the golden time for longer tracks. We're looking at like the mid 70s with tracks like But we can actually trace this further back into the 60s with tracks like... But honestly, I want to start going way back, and I'm talking about way back. I'm even talking further than that. I'm talking about before this, like, I almost said this century, but honestly it was the last century, the 1900s. Jeez, I feel old. I'm talking like way back in our history. There we go. Back in ye olden times, there wasn't a set down time length that a track needed to be or should be. It wasn't out of the norm to have songs go on for a half hour. I mean, for example, the track that I used, Beethoven, a track from Beethoven's Ninth Century. Beethoven's Ninth Century was first performed in 1824. So yeah, and that was his longest symphony. It is his longest symphony, and it had more than, I think it's comprised of 4 movements, and 3 of those movements go on for more than 20 minutes. And even if we go further than that, Handel's Messiah, which was written back in 1741, is almost 3 hours long and has many tracks or movements that go on for almost a half hour. So what I'm saying with all of this is that for the past 3 centuries, long songs were expected, and they weren't seen as an oddball kind of a thing. They went on for as long as they needed to go. And this was across all the different, classical genres of the time. Symphonies, concertos, operas, ballets, they all had longer stretches of movements, or as we would kind of depict them now as like tracks or songs. There was no 3 to 4 minute cutoff point where they had to like stop. You just played until the song was done. This was seen right up until the 20th century. George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, comprised in 1924, sits around the 17-minute mark, and it's one of the more popular pieces of music that we listen to today. I mean, it made itself known in The Great Gatsby, directed by Baz Luhrmann. It had its own short on Fantasia 2000, and people don't bat an eye at that track length. Talking about popular songs even within our own zeitgeist now, Stravinsky's The Firebird, which was first composed and performed in 1910, that was later revisited in 1919, which later on in 1945 kind of got another reworking. It has movements that are well within 10-minute marks, and depending on which version you're going for, you're either getting an hour and a half worth of music, or you're getting, 45 minutes worth of music. And even if we move away from classical music and into other genres of the time, sticking into the 20th century, you're looking at jazz from the 30s all the way up to the 60s and 70s, with tracks going into the 20-minute mark. I mean, Miles Davis with The Bitches Brew was no stranger to the longer stretches of music. So the question really shouldn't be why are long songs, and not even why they are becoming popular now, but rather, why did they stop being long? And in some ways, they never really did. I mean, see new compositions of classical music, contemporary jazz, and modern progressive rock. Heck, even looking at popular metal acts like Metallica or Megadeth or, any of those big 4, they had songs that ranged from 10 minutes plus, and that was back in the 80s when it was a wasteland of that kind of stuff. But long songs did fall out of vogue within popular music. I mean, that's hard to deny. Where are they? But even within the past, it came right around when longer songs within popular music were at an all-time high, both times, because there were a falling from grace, a rising of the popular longer track, and then falling from grace again. So to say that longer songs from a 3-century streak within classical music and other expressions like jazz and musical theater just fell out of the popular eye would be an oversimplification of things. There are a lot of different factors at work to kind of bring the social zeitgeist to a point where long songs weren't necessarily a thing to be sought after. So one of the factors that I think happened, especially around like 30s, 40s, and 50s was the popularity in recording production and recorded music. You no longer had to go out to a venue or like a symphony or a pub or whatnot to enjoy music. You can buy music on records or a little bit later on cassette tape, or if you had a lot of money, reel to reel, and enjoy it at your house. Sound systems to play it on became much more affordable, so it opened up the market to the common consumer. You no longer had to be a part of the 1% to afford this kind of musical production. And even the musical format itself of long play records, there was kind of a built-in limitation to how long you could actually listen to music at any one go. You could only have about 25 minutes, give or take, per side, even though some tracks could be squished in to fill a little bit longer. I have Handel's Messiah on LP on a record, and they were able to fit in like a 30 to 35 minute movement onto one side of music. So it's able to be done, it's just most people don't do it now. Paired with this is the musical production side of things, actually getting the music onto the record. When a band was trying to kind of showcase their musical variety and their musical talents, songs would need to be a little bit shorter to fit more tracks onto the record. Record producers would kind of push bands to write tracks that were a little bit shorter so that they can put more of a variety of songs on the records, including a mix of already well-known songs as well as their own written songs. And who are bands to disagree at this point? I mean, back then, you didn't have the multi-mixing, multi-tracked recording technology that you do today, or even a few years in the future of when that was going on. Essentially, they would just sit in a large room and play a show for a single microphone to have it be recorded. If they made a mistake, they would have to start the track all the way back at the very beginning. So it's a little bit easier to record a 3-minute track than it was to record a 15-minute track, mainly because a 15-minute track has a lot more music to screw up than a 3-minute track. And if you do screw up, there's a lot less music to go back and re-record. So kind of made sense why bands weren't really being pushed to record longer stretches of music. And on top of this, you also had the radio. I mean, think about it. You only have 24 hours of a day to broadcast a certain amount of songs. And honestly, of that 24, you maybe have 12 to 8 hours that people are actually tuning into. So station producers would like to have short tracks so that they can fill as many tracks across to sell more records. They didn't want to eat up a lot of programming time with a single track. They wanted to have as many tracks go through a, broadcasting cycle as they possibly could. If your song was 10 minutes long, you're pushing at least another track, sometimes 2 or 3 tracks, out of the programming cycle that now they can't advertise those tracks for the record companies to try and sell. I can understand why from the 30s to about the 60s, songs were shorter to help both fill spots on the radio cycle as well as fill more songs on a record. And as we all know, things change, things evolve, things mature, maybe? And that changed within the mid-60s with bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys treating albums less like a collection of songs to be enjoyed and much more like a single piece of art. The introduction of multi-track layering, of mixing, of mastering kind of came into the fold so that you were able to put out longer stretches of music without having to compromise a recording session's time. On top of that, you had bands from the psychedelic movement like Pink Floyd coming in and experimenting things that led to an amazing and massive experimental projects led by King Crimson. So this is really where the emergence of progressive rock came from, a style of music that embraced that classical music ideology of a song being as long as it needed to be. In fact, bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer would rewrite and perform full-on classical pieces. Bands like Yes would open their concert with Stravinsky's The Firebird, and John Anderson, the lead singer of Yes, would sing and hum movements from The Rite of Spring that you can hear on their live albums. Bands like Genesis would put out tracks like Supper's Ready that were 20 plus minutes, and Jethro Tull would put out Thick as a Brick and A Passion Play back to back that were one track across an entire album. Heck, even Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here, one of their more popular albums to date, opened and closed with Shining You Crazy Diamond, parts 1 through 5 and 6 through 12 or whatever it was, both being well over 10 minutes in mark. And later in the 70s, they would put out Animals with a track called Dogs that was 17 minutes long. And this isn't even talking about Atom Heart Mother or Echoes that they put out earlier in their discography that took up an entire album side. And even more popular still, you had Rush putting out 3 20-plus minute tracks with The Fountain of Lament from Caress of Steel, Hemispheres from the same titled album, and of course everybody's favorite, 2112. So there was an explosion of bands and artists putting out tracks that went into 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes in length. And then what happened? You know, from the late 60s to the mid to late 70s, we had this massive explosion of these longer songs. And once we get to the late 70s and early 80s, they just completely disappeared entirely. So really, what happened? And so the musical cycle has already been through this once before. You know, you had the kind of already pre-established idea that songs didn't really need a time limit, to songs needing a time limit for record production and radio play and all that kind of stuff, to not needing those crutches and those stipulations anymore and allowing songs to be as long as they want, to it not. I mean, we've seen the rise and fall. So why didn't it happen again? And again, to say that it just fell out of popularity or fell out of cultural zeitgeist is a little bit of oversimplifying things, as there really isn't a clear answer as to why it fell out of popularity. But I have a few theories as to why this occurred. The first, progressive rock movement from the 70s was so big that it essentially burned itself out, you know, a real Stravinsky's Firebird. Much like any musical style, this one had its time. The mass populace just happened to be done with it. That and a new sound was coming up to kind of play the antithesis of progressive rock that really, you know, the movement of which you can still kind of see the remnants of today. And I'm not talking about disco. In fact, I actually think that disco embodies a lot of progressive rock's ideology. I mean, look at MacArthur's Park. It was originally written in 1968 by Jim Webb, made popular by Richard Harris, only to be reworked and re-recorded by Donna Summers in 1978 as like a disco dance movement. Donna took what was originally a 7-minute track and reworked it into a 17-minute track. What's really more prog than that? I mean, look at what Yes did with Simon & Garfunkel's America. For me personally, I think it was the 1-2 punch of punk and new wave. Punk was really the rock in opposition for progressive rock and prog. The songs were rarely over 3 minutes long. Instead of emphasis being placed on an orchestral and orchestration of music, they would play as fast as they could, and sometimes even as bad as they could, on purpose. Instead of being polished, they were raw. Instead of being sophisticated, they were vulgar and obscene. And people ate it up. People loved it. It should also come as no surprise that I'm not a big fan of punk, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I also see its merit, and I also see why it came about when it came about. Instead of veiling message behind stories and allegories like Rush did with Hemispheres, or what Pink Floyd did with Animals, they would just come right out and say it. You know, tact and subtlety wasn't something that was in the punk lexicon. I mean, they would actively rage against progressive rock. It's very well documented that Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols would wear a t-shirt saying, you know, I hate Pink Floyd, and you know, according to legends, that's how he got the gig as the Sex Pistols lead singer. Now, whether or not that actually happened, the fans ate it up, and they obviously agreed with it. So there was something to back up that claim. And on top of that, with the, let's not say failures, but at least the commercially underwhelming success of the prog bands of the late 70s as they entered into the 80s, saw most of these bands in retaliation to their prog outfits being not really well received, saw them either fade out or transition into something completely different. I mean, if you look at it, Pink Floyd basically collapsed on themselves after the release of the 80s albums of The Wall and The Final Cut, and they really didn't resurface until 1987 with half the personnel they had going into The Wall and completely reworking their sound to be more of an 80s contemporary rock than any kind of semblance of prog. And I know that's a gross oversimplification of what happened to Pink Floyd in the 80s, but you know, I only have a certain amount of runtime for this video. Genesis went pop in the 80s, but they always were able to sneak on a 10-minute track. You know, they still had that prog aspect on it, even if they had to condense it into 2 tracks, with songs like Home by the Sea and Domino, and later on The Fading Lights and Driving the Last Spike. And Emerson, Lake and Palmer very early on went very pop with their Love Beach album that, you know, we don't really talk about all that much. The only one to really keep within the prog vein was King Crimson, who went experimental math jazz, which I honestly wasn't a big fan of, but it's hard to argue that it's prog in nature. They just condensed the songs down, and they didn't really have too many songs that went past the 10-minute mark at that point. And even our dear Summer Childs of Rush and Yes went full on synthwave in the 80s, which kind of brings me to my next point. So now we've seen kind of why, at least I think, progressive rock was kind of kicked to the curb. Punk rock kind of killed progressive rock, but it also kind of begs the question of why progressive rock didn't recover, or at least immediately come back into the fold of things. What was different this time around? And the first was a lot of the musical expressions that came after punk. The first being new wave. This style of music wasn't anything to do with the music of the past. That was kind of their MO. And they only really wanted to capture whatever the sound of the future was going to be, which should have been great for prog and for the longer stretches of music. It would mean that there would be no conceived or preconceived notions of what songs should sound like, or even the length of the tracks, and it should have no set down time limit. And I mean, you did have, you know, some krautrock groups and some things that came out of this more synthwave stuff, such as Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk, that would stretch their tracks into the 10 and 20-minute mark. But again, these were more of the exceptions to the rule, and they kind of found their own little niche audience in that set thing. You wouldn't hear any of these tracks off of the contemporary radio stations of the time. They were more interested in the novelty of sounds being captured and less about song construction in that sense. So once that novelty of the sound wore off, there wasn't too far to go in terms of track lengths. We did see a little bit of a blip in terms of progressive rock in the 80s with the neo-prog outfits of Marillion and IQ that wrote tracks that were into the 10 and 20-minute mark, but they only really found traction with like die-hard prog fans and not really with the popular ear. This would be found a little bit within the metal stream that I've already mentioned before, that found an audience with an appetite for longer tracks, but really outside of maybe Metallica and Megadeth, none of them were really big enough to have their tracks heard on the radio. So we saw that there were longer songs being written by more niche bands, instead of something to be embraced by the populace. And once we moved away from the 80s and more into the 90s, we do see that punk's influence bled into the rock that we saw that was coming in at the time with grunge. This was another musical style that heavily frowned upon longer tracks. I mean, once a track got, you know, past the 3-minute mark, most of the people were looking at their watch being like, all right, come on, let's wrap her up. Even new wave gave us more of the soft rock acts and the big pop stars of the time. I mean, look at Phil Collins, who started off with a prog band and went completely into the soft rock, ballad rock of the time. Outside of Meatloaf's extended version and album version of I Would Do Anything for Love, I honestly can't think of another song that went past the 7-minute mark of the time. I mean, we have Guns N' Roses' Coma, that goes into the 9-minute, even November Rain, that goes into 7 minutes. And speaking of Rain, I think, Prince had Purple Rain that touched about 7 minutes long, but nothing that went past the 10-minute mark. And from here, it just kind of lent itself into the new millennia, and we have our current climate of music that we have now. Every once in a while, a popular band will come out with a longer song, but as I've mentioned time and time again in this little video, it seems to be more of an outlier or a band from a subgenre rather than a pop superstar. And I've always really been interested into why songs aren't longer nowadays within the populace eye. When I ask prog fans who love longer songs why they feel like most people don't listen to longer songs, I usually get the same response that aren't great, if I'm being perfectly honest. I mean, when I chat with friends about this, and I remember chatting with one in specific, he said that people nowadays just don't have the attention span. You know, people need to have their bite-sized chunks. They can't engage with anything longer than a few minutes. Others would even echo his sentiment, saying that people were lazy. They didn't want to connect with a track longer than that. They didn't have that same level of appreciation for music as we prog fans did. I want to counter against that, because I honestly don't think that's true. Just look at big popular movies that are getting longer and longer and longer. I mean, Endgame was, nearly 3 hours, if not more? The big Lord of the Rings box sets, each film being 4 hours long, and most people watching them back to back to back. Dune and No Time to Die being the two big popular movies of the fall, both are over 2.5 hours long. And people are being able to binge watch full TV series in a full week. And so I'm really not quite sure if the whole we don't have attention spans really holds any water anymore. I also think that this line of reasoning isn't really the healthiest, as it does put an odd "I'm better than thou" as my tastes are so much more sophisticated and better than yours, when really it's just different. You know, everybody's tastes are different, and I'm always curious as to why. You know, why does something that resonates with me doesn't necessarily resonate with you, and why does something that resonates with you doesn't necessarily resonate with me? So I'm always kind of interested in that, and that's why I will always ask friends that don't like longer songs, well, why is that? And I even raised this point with another friend of mine who does work in the movie industry. Why is it that people will sit down for a 3-hour movie, but they won't be able to sit down for a 10-minute song? Is it because they don't have that same kind of appetite for longer stretches of media? And she actually pointed out that it's less about the length of the movie in comparison to the song. Albums have been getting longer and longer now that CDs and streaming sites are able to package albums with longer and longer runtimes. It's more about scenes in a movie with songs on an album, and that is a little bit more of a 1-to-1 ratio. Nobody really wants to sit down and watch a movie that has like a 20-minute scene that's unbroken. It just gets grating on the eye and people lose interest. Although I do counter with, kind of like the one-shot movies like 1917, I think it was, Hardcore Henry, and there was a Kung Fu movie that was recently put out that basically was just like one unbroken action sequence. But I also see that those one takes don't really go past 1 or 2 minutes in movies proper. The last one that I can remember on a very popular movie was the opening sequence of Spectre from James Bond, where it had this continuous scene. So I guess what she was saying is has a little bit more merit. We shouldn't think of it as like a 1-to-1 ratio of songs and movie media, but more of like a 1-to-1 ratio of scenes in movies. Yeah, I mean, it seems for the time being and for the past 4 decades that, much like Stravinsky's Firebird, the land of longer songs has been burned away, and the only plants that have spread out from the scorched earth are very few and far between. But much like, Stravinsky's Firebird, from the ashes, new growth and new life is found. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it does seem as though more bands are trying and dipping their foot into a 10-minute mark track. Not just prog bands that have basically embraced the spirit of the past to recapture what the bands of the early 70s were doing, such as Dream Theater, Transatlantic, Haken, and all of them. And not even like niche bands such as The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die, Explosions in the Sky, Swans, Godspeed You Black Emperor. And I even made a video back in 2018 discussing if prog would ever become mainstream again, and my main tenet is probably not, unless, for whatever reason, bigger acts like Taylor Swift started making tracks that were 10 minutes long. But now that we've seen Taylor Swift make a big 10-minute version of All Too Well, it seems as though the prophecy is beginning to fulfill itself. But honestly, it's still pretty hard to say, and even probably still too soon to say. Coldplay and Taylor Swift and even Adele, they are still kind of the outliers rather than the rule, but they are still opening the door and showing record producers and record companies that the mass populace can and do enjoy tracks over 10 minutes. So that when newer artists and bands decide to write and record 10 minutes, record producers don't slam the door in front of their faces saying, nah, they don't want to listen to that. Now, does this also mean that Taylor Swift's next studio album, that she doesn't, retouch one of her old albums, which I've been loving, by the way, does it mean that her next full-length studio album is going to be a full-fledged concept album with a 20-minute long song? Probably not. Do I want that? With every single fiber of my being do I want that. And I also hope that record studios and artists sees that I am now not the only one who does want that and will embrace that. We are starting to hunger for those longer stretches of music and those longer run times on tracks. So it kind of does go to show that nature is finally healing, and I'm honestly extremely excited to see what the musical landscape is going to become, because nothing grows from a more fertile ground than one that has been scorched from a fire. So much like the Firebird from Stravinsky, hopefully Prog will see a new day. Thank you guys so much for watching my little video essay on why are long songs, or the fall and rise and fall again of longer tracks. This has been on my mind for quite a while, so very excited to actually sit down and talk it through and talk it over with you guys. Let me know of your own thoughts. Why was there such a big explosion of longer tracks in the mid-70s to it being essentially removed from Earth and nobody even wanting to touch a longer track for the longest time, to it starting to come back into vogue? It was something that I've been thinking about when, pretty much the last 3 or 4 centuries when music was really first being a thing. Nobody said, oh, music has to stop at 3 minutes. Why are we putting those labels on that now? So anyway, that's my own little thought. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope I've kind of stirred your own thinkers into this. I know most of my audience are prog fans such as myself, so most of us were screaming at the screen the entire time, being like, oh, well, we have long songs, look at these bands. I really hope that moving forward within the musical sphere, popular bands and artists will not shy away from the longer songs, and we're starting to see that. So hey, if you like what you see, go and subscribe. If you haven't already, it's just one click away, and I like to see my subscriber count rise. It's kind of fun. I recently passed 15,000 subscribers, so yay. If you want to follow me on social media, I've left the links down below as well. I'm most active on Twitter, where I've kind of facilitated a nice corner of happy, feel-good, yay kind of stuff. All that's found down below. I'm less active on Instagram, even though I'm on there every once in a while. That's all I've got. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.